Hello, Llewyn and Lakely. I thought I'd read you a story. I haven't got Cuddles today because he's been a bit naughty and he's having a sulk at the other end of the room. So I have got Rover, and he's come to share the story. Say hello, Rover. Yay! So the story we're going to read is called The Elves and the Shoemaker. The Elves and the Shoemaker. Long ago, there was an old shoemaker whose shoes were once admired far and wide. But years of hammering heels and stitching leather had left him in agony. His back ached and his fingers throbbed. He could no longer make such wonderful shoes. All day long, the shoemaker stood at the entrance to his shop, watching people come and go. In the past, his shop had been full of customers, eager to buy his shoes. But now, no one came, and his shop sat silent and empty. The shoemaker stared at the last scraps of leather and sighed. He had enough to make one more pair of shoes, but would anyone buy them? The shoemaker's wife saw how upset her husband was and knew he needed rest. "Come to bed, dear," she called to him. "We can think about it again in the morning." The shoemaker left the leather on the workbench. He knew he would soon have to close his shop forever. But the very next morning, there, on the shoemaker's workbench, was a brand new pair of shoes. And what stunning shoes! Sleek and stylish and exquisitely stitched. The shoemaker put them on display, and soon a crowd had gathered outside his shop. What fabulous footwear, they all agreed. The shoemaker sold the pair of shoes the moment the shop opened. The shoemaker sold the new shoes the moment he opened his shop. Now he could afford leather to make 2 pairs of shoes. That night, the shoemaker left the leather on his workbench again and went to bed. The next morning, there was another surprise. There was 2 new pairs of boots stood on the bench. They were even more magnificent than the shoes, with twirly patterns and pointed shoes. 2 new pairs of boots stood on the bench. They were even more magnificent than the shoes, with twirly patterns and pointed toes. The first pair of shoes had sold in minutes. These boots were so splendid that they sold in seconds. The shoemaker and his wife were flabbergasted, but delighted. Who was making these wonderful shoes and boots? They had no idea. Who could it be, or how? The first pair of shoes had sold in minutes. These boots were so splendid that they sold in seconds. The shoemaker and his wife were flabbergasted, but delighted. Who was making these wonderful shoes and boots? They had no idea who it could be or how they were getting into the workshop. It was as if a guardian angel were watching over them. The strange shoe magic continued for weeks. Each night the shoemaker left leather on his workbench, and each morning he discovered brand new shoes. Sometimes 3 or 4 pairs appeared overnight, and each time they were finer than the morning before. Some had fancy ribbons, others had elegant buckles or handsome high heels. Word spread that the shoemaker was making fine shoes again, and customers came from far and wide to buy them. The shoemaker was happy, but more and more he felt awkward about his change of fortune. They weren't his shoes after all. Someone else was doing all the work, and he wanted to know who. So one night he made a plan. "Let's hide in the workshop tonight," he told his wife. "We can see who comes." That night the shoe shop door opened with a creak. The shoemaker and his wife hid as two shadows darted across the golden moonlight. As the shoemaker and his wife watched, two tiny creatures in raggedy clothes sprang up onto the workbench. They were giggling and grinning and dancing and singing. "They're elves," the shoemaker's wife gasped. "All of this time, have two tiny little elves been making all those incredible boots and shoes?" The shoemaker and his wife gazed in astonishment as the elves got to work. Smiling and singing, the little creatures hammered at heels and stitched leather. By the first light of morning, the latest pairs of shoes were finished. The cheery elves leaped from the bench and scampered away. The shoemaker and his wife could barely believe what they had seen, but the new shoes proved it was real, and they were the finest yet. "What magical creatures those elves are," the shoemaker's wife said. "Somehow we must repay their kindness." The shoemaker agreed. But what could he make for an elf? The shoemaker had an idea. For the first time in weeks, he sat at his workbench, cutting and stitching leather and cloth. His back ached and his fingers throbbed, but he didn't give up. Even as his candle burned down and his eyes stung in its flickering light, the shoemaker left what he had made on the workbench for the elves to find and went to bed. Later that night, the elves crept silently into the shop. When they saw the shoemaker's gifts, they squealed with joy. "What fantastic new suits!" they cried in delight. "Such terrific top hats and tails!" The suits were finer than anything worn by dukes or lords or princes or kings. The elves danced around the workbench, gleefully singing about their magnificent new clothes. "What happy little elves are we," one sang. "No longer workmen shall we be. We look so fine in our new suits." The other elves joined in. "No longer shall we stitch new boots." Finally, they skipped out of the shoe shop into the silvery moonlight, still singing and dancing and giggling about how handsome they both looked in their new clothes. As they ran off, one of the elves called out, "Thank you, shoemaker, and goodbye." The shoemaker and his wife watched them disappear into the night. "Thank you too," the shoemaker whispered. Thanks to those kind little creatures, he and his wife could live comfortably for the rest of their lives. The end. That's a lovely story, isn't it? Well, Lewin and Lakely, I think it's time for bed now. So wave goodbye to Rover. Good night.